All right, so today we're going to be doing a deep dive into the story of Anne Frank
Okay.
based on her Wikipedia entry.
All right.
Most people probably already know Anne Frank as the German-born Jewish girl
Mm-hmm.
who documented her life in hiding
Right.
during the Nazi occupation of the Netherlands.
Yes.
Um, and her diary has really made her one of the most talked about victims of the Holocaust.
For sure. For sure.
So what we're going to try to do today is really understand, the key events of her life,
Okay.
the context of her diary, and why it continues to have such a profound impact to this day.
Sounds good.
So let's dive right in.
Okay.
I think those people who are listening probably already know
Yeah.
the basics of Anne Frank's story, but
Right.
maybe, just to refresh everyone's memories.
Yeah.
She was born Anneliese Marie Frank
Okay.
on June 12th, 1929 in Frankfurt, Germany.
Mm-hmm.
And she was the younger sister of Margot
Right.
and the daughter of Otto and Edith Frank.
Okay.
And her parents were what they called liberal Jews.
Yeah. So in this context, liberal means that they identified culturally with Judaism, but they weren't strictly observant
Right.
religiously.
They weren't going to synagogue every week and
Exactly.
keeping kosher and things like that.
Yeah. They were more, culturally Jewish.
Right.
Yeah.
So as you might already know, the Nazi Party was gaining a lot of power in Germany in the 1930s.
Mm-hmm.
And in
Yeah.
1934, Otto Frank decided to move his family to Amsterdam.
Yeah, that was a smart move for them.
Yeah. Amsterdam was seen as a relatively safe haven for Jews at the time.
Yeah, it was a very cosmopolitan city at the time.
Right.
And there was a large Jewish community there. So
Wow.
it seemed like a good place to escape the growing anti-Semitism in Germany.
Right. And so they moved there, and, Anne started attending the 6 Montessori school there,
Yeah.
which is actually later renamed the Anne Frank School.
Oh, wow.
And she adapted quickly to her new surroundings. She learned Dutch
Okay.
and made new friends, and things were, seemingly going well.
Yeah, it sounds like they were starting to build a new life for themselves.
Right. But of course, that was all shattered in May 1940 when Germany invaded the Netherlands,
Oh, right.
and Amsterdam, which had been this relative haven,
Hmm.
was now under Nazi occupation.
So they were trapped.
Right.
Yeah.
And so life for Jews in Amsterdam became increasingly difficult. There were all these new restrictions.
Yeah.
Things like curfews. They had to wear the yellow star.
Oh, wow.
They couldn't own businesses.
Oh, my gosh.
And then in 1941, Anne lost her German citizenship.
Okay.
So her family became stateless.
Oh, so they were really in a precarious situation.
Right. And Otto Frank actually tried to emigrate to the United States.
Okay.
But those efforts were unsuccessful
Why?
because the U.S. consulate in Rotterdam was bombed and all his paperwork was destroyed.
Oh, my gosh. So close.
Right. Yeah. So you can imagine, how desperate they were
Yeah.
to escape.
Of course.
But all these avenues are being closed off.
Right.
And so in 1941, Anne was forced to transfer to the Jewish Lyceum.
Which was basically a segregated school.
Right, for Jewish children.
Yeah, yeah.
And so this is all happening sort of as a backdrop to the diary.
Okay.
So as most people know, Anne received a diary for her 13th birthday on June 12th, 1942.
Okay.
And she named it Kitty.
Ah.
And the first few entries are pretty typical, teenage girl stuff.
I see.
She talks about her friends and her crushes and her classes.
Mm.
But as the situation in Amsterdam worsens, you can see how her diary entries become much more serious.
Yeah.
And she starts to write about the fear and the uncertainty that she and her family are feeling.
Right.
And so in July 1942, Margot Frank received a call-up notice from the Nazi authorities.
Okay.
And this basically meant that she was going to be deported to a work camp.
Right.
And so Otto Frank knew that it was time to go into hiding.
So the call-up notice really forced their hand?
Right, exactly.
Right.
And they'd actually been planning to go into hiding for a while, but they were hoping to wait until later in the summer.
I see.
But Margot's call-up notice meant that they had to leave immediately.
So they had to accelerate their plans.
Right. And so on July 6, 1942,
Okay, yeah.
the Frank family, along with 4 other people, went into hiding in a secret annex.
Where was this annex?
It was located in the building where Otto Frank's business was located.
Okay.
And it was basically this concealed space behind a bookcase.
Wow. So it was very well hidden.
Right, yeah. And the annex was actually quite small. It was only about 500 square feet.
Okay.
And it had to accommodate 8 people.
Wow.
And the people who went into hiding with the Frank family were Herman Van Pels,
Okay.
August Van Pels, and their son Peter.
Okay.
And then later on, a dentist named Fritz Pfeffer joined them.
So 8 people in total.
Right.
Yeah.
And so for over 2 years, they lived in this secret annex.
Wow.
They couldn't go outside.
Right.
They had to be very quiet during the day. And they were completely reliant on a small group of helpers.
Who were these helpers?
Well, the helpers were employees of Otto Frank's business.
Okay.
The main ones were Miep Gies, Johannes Kleiman, Victor Kugler, and Bev Fuskel.
Wow. So these people were really risking their lives.
Right. They were bringing food and supplies to the annex, and they were keeping them up to date on what was happening in the outside world.
Right.
And Anne actually developed a very close relationship with Bev Fuskel.
That's nice.
And she wrote about her a lot in her diary.
Okay.
And so life in the annex was obviously very difficult.
Yeah.
They were living in very close quarters.
Right.
There was a lot of tension. There were arguments.
Yeah.
And they were constantly afraid of being discovered.
Oh, yeah, I bet.
But in spite of all of that, there were also moments of joy and laughter and love. And Anne's diary really captures all of that.
Yeah, it must have been really hard for Anne being a teenager during all of this, right? I mean, imagine being cooped up with your family.
Yeah.
For 2 years.
Yeah.
During a time of war.
Yeah.
And you're not allowed to go outside or see your friends.
Right.
It's hard to even imagine.
Yeah.
But Anne found ways to cope. She wrote in her diary. She read books.
Okay.
She studied. And she even developed a crush on Peter Van Pels.
Oh.
Who was the son of one of the other families in hiding.
Yeah.
And so, their relationship is a big part of the diary.
Right.
And it's really interesting to see how their relationship develops over time.
Yeah.
They start out as just friends, but then they start to develop feelings for each other.
Yeah.
And they even share their first kiss. But of course, their relationship is complicated by the fact that they're living in such close quarters.
Right.
And, they're both under a lot of stress.
Yeah.
But, I think it's a really beautiful and touching part of the story. Yeah.
And so Anne's diary really gives us this incredibly intimate glimpse into her life. She writes about everything.
Right.
Her thoughts, her feelings, her hopes, her dreams, her fears.
Yeah.
And it's all written with this incredible honesty and vulnerability.
Yeah. It's really remarkable for someone so young.
Right. She was only 13 when she started writing the diary.
Wow.
And 15 when she was arrested. And so, her writing is just so raw and so real.
Yeah.
And it's really no wonder that her diary has had such a profound impact on people all over the world.
Yeah.
So, we've talked a lot about Anne's life in the annex, but I think it's important to also talk about what happened after they were discovered.
Okay.
So on August 4th, 1944, the secret annex was raided by the Gestapo.
Yeah, wow.
And all 8 people in hiding were arrested.
Oh, my gosh.
And we still don't know for sure who betrayed them.
Oh, really?
There are a lot of theories.
Yeah.
But no one has ever been definitively identified.
Okay.
And so after they were arrested, the Franks were taken to a transit camp called Westerbork.
Okay.
And then from there, they were deported to Auschwitz.
Oh, my gosh.
Which was a concentration extermination camp in Poland.
Right.
And upon arriving at Auschwitz, the men were separated from the women.
Right.
And Anne and Margot were sent to the women's camp.
Okay.
And the conditions in Auschwitz were just horrific.
Yeah, I can't even imagine.
There was overcrowding, starvation, disease, forced labor.
It's awful.
And in October 1944, Edith Frank died in Auschwitz.
Oh, my gosh.
We don't know exactly how she died.
Okay.
But it's likely that it was from a combination of starvation and exhaustion.
Right.
And then in November 1944, Anne and Margot were transferred to another concentration camp called Bergen-Belsen.
Where's that?
That's in Germany.
Okay.
And the conditions in Bergen-Belsen were even worse than Auschwitz.
How is that even possible?
I know, it's hard to believe.
Yeah.
But, there was a typhus epidemic raging through the camp.
Okay.
And there was very little food or water.
Oh, my God.
And so in February or March 1945,
Okay.
both Anne and Margot died from typhus.
Oh, my gosh.
Anne was only 15 years old.
That's so sad.
Yeah, it's incredibly tragic.
Yeah.
And Otto Frank was the only member of his family to survive the Holocaust.
Oh, wow.
After the war, he returned to Amsterdam.
Okay.
And he was given Anne's diary by Miep Gies,
Oh, wow.
who had saved it after the Franks were arrested.
Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Otto Frank was so moved by his daughter's writing
Mm-hmm.
that he decided to have it published.
Wow.
And so Anne Frank's diary was first published in 1947.
Okay.
And it quickly became a bestseller.
Wow.
And it's been translated into over 70 languages.
Wow.
And it's been adapted into numerous plays and films.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, Anne Frank's diary has really become this incredibly important historical document. It gives us this firsthand account of what it was like to be a Jew in hiding during the Holocaust.
Yeah.
And it also speaks to the universal human experience of adolescence.
Mm-hmm.
The hopes and dreams and fears that all teenagers go through.
Right.
And so I think that's why her diary continues to resonate with people all over the world.
Yeah, I think her story is just so powerful and so moving.
Right. And, it's a reminder that even in the darkest of times,
Mm-hmm.
there's still hope and beauty to be found.
Yeah.
And it's also a reminder that we must never forget the victims of the Holocaust.
Right.
And we must never let something like that happen again.
Yeah, I think that's a really important message.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, I think that's one of the reasons why Anne Frank's story is so important.
Yeah.
It's a story that needs to be told,
Hmm.
and it's a story that needs to be remembered.
Yeah, for sure.
And so, I hope that this deep dive has given you a better understanding of Anne Frank's life and legacy.
I think,
And I hope that it's inspired you to learn more about the Holocaust.
yeah, me too.
And to fight against intolerance and hatred in all its forms.
Yeah, that's so important.
So thanks for listening.
Thanks for having me.
So I want to leave you with this thought. Anne Frank's story is obviously very well known.
Mm-hmm.
But there are so many other stories in the Holocaust that are not as well known.
Right.
And so I think it's important for us to seek out those stories.
Yeah,
And to learn from them.
absolutely.
Because, each individual story helps us to better understand the horrors of the Holocaust.
Yeah,
And it helps us to honor the memory of those who were lost.
I agree.
So, if you're interested in learning more about the Holocaust, there are a lot of great resources available.
Mm-hmm.
You can visit the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum website.
Okay.
You can read books like Night by Elie Wiesel,
Okay.
or Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl.
Mm-hmm.
And, there are also a lot of great documentaries and films out there.
Yeah.
And so, I encourage you to just take some time to learn more about this important period in history.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea.
So thanks again for listening.
Thanks for having me.
And we'll see you next time.
See ya.